And that brings us over to the psychosexual stages of development, which by their very name you might leap to the conclusion, rightly so, that they're controversial. So fixation is part of this. So if you talk about people who are fixated, fixated in a Freudian sense is a cathexis, a binding of energy at a certain stage of development such that it's never really resolved, and one always in evidences unresolved conflicts from a certain stage of development. From my interpretation, that's really in stage 1 or 2, and I'll talk about some common ones that you'll probably be aware of. So what you get is stereotyped behaviors from a person who is cathected or fixated in an early stage of psychosexual development. Now, when you're talking psychosexual development here, there is this whole idea that people get uncomfortable about, because he's talking about sexual behavior in children, but not overt sexual behavior like sexual intercourse, but intergender behavior that indicates what's going to come later, which is a desire for sexual behavior. And that's evidenced from his point of view in a very early stage of our development, and people become, I think, quite, reasonably uncomfortable. Again, I always reiterate, this is Freud, not Dula. I'm just giving you Freud's theories as I interpret them. So we have 5 stages of psychosexual development. And if you remember, we were talking about Erik Erikson when we were talking about development per se, and he had 8 stages of development. And I said the first 5 are really just reworks of Freud's 5 stages of psychosexual development, where he added 3 additional stages and said life is never a point in life where you don't develop. Right? Development is a lifelong process. But he got those original 5 stages from Freud. He was a psychoanalytic theorist himself. So Erik Erikson and many other people were very much influenced by Freud. And so let's go back and look now at this set of developmental stages. Why here? Because these are really crucial to the formation of personality, and that's the chapter we're talking about. In fact, all of this that we've talked about thus far is, from a Freudian point of view, personality structure. So now we've got our 5 sexual development stages, psychosexual development stages. And anytime you say something that you didn't mean to say, Freud would say you really meant to say that. When we have these things called Freudian Slip, so you say one thing but meant your mother, all right? So that kind of idea is a Freudian concept where our id has these impulses, and we kind of have a radar screen inside our mind that filters out the inappropriate, but sometimes we say something that seems really inappropriate. We go, oh, I didn't mean to say that. And Freud would say, yeah, actually, you did mean to say that because you did really think that. Oral stage, 0 to 1 years old. Pleasure now, the erogenous zone centers on the mouth. The centering of the pleasure on the mouth is pretty obvious to anybody who looks at an infant. You hand an infant anything, and the first thing they do is what? Put it in their mouth. They stick it right up to their mouth. Now, there's a lot of other explanations for that, but Freud just said, well, that's where pleasure is centered, right? The mouth. They put their mouth all over it. They put their tongue all over it. That's why you got to be very careful. Kids will choke themselves readily if they are given the wrong things, because the first thing they're going to do is stick it in their mouth. So for him, that's the oral stage of development. It's the most basic level. And oral stage also talks about survival, right? Because you have to take in nutrients. And back in Freud's day and prior to Freud's day, there was only one way to do that when you were an infant, and that was through the breast, the nipple. The mother's milk had to be obtained. And if you didn't obtain it, you died. They didn't have formula and microwaves and all that other stuff. If a mother couldn't produce breast milk, then they had to find a wet nurse, somebody who had recently given birth and had enough milk to spare that they could also feed another child. So for him, this becomes crucial to understanding how the infant sees its world, because for Freud, the infant and the mother are not separate entities from the infant's point of view. They're one and the same. The breast is life. It is a powerful source of sustenance. You can't live without it. And for him, the infant really fuses, bonds with the mother in a very profound way that the infant will have to go through the process of individuating from. Then you get the anal stage, where now the pleasure center is on the anus, which sounds really weird to most people. Anal stage, pleasure from the anus, really? But we're talking also about eliminative functions, right? Being able to pee and poo when you want to, because that's one of the fundamental accomplishments of people who are 1 to 3 years old, right? It's toilet training. And that's symbolic of an individual trying to assert themselves in the world, right? Trying to establish some level of independence. Because up to that point, they're completely dependent on other people for their survival. They pee and they poo because they have no control over that. And somebody has to come and they clean it up, right? They have sphincters, muscular orifices that cannot be controlled, but sooner or later you learn to control that. And you pee when you want to pee, or you poo and where you want to poo. And parents very much want you to do this. They want you to develop that ability pretty quickly, as soon as you can, because they would prefer that they don't have to clean up after you for a very long period of time. You have to early on, but sooner or later you're going to gain the ability to do it for yourself and engage in some territory disputes. That's what's going to happen, right? You want to do what you want to do when you want to do it. Again, remember the id's dominating here, and little toddlers at 2 years old, they may not want to do what you want them to do. They fight sometimes. They say, no, no, I won't do it. And that's the struggle. The struggle is between this emerging individual and the fused mother or caregiver who was once now one, by the infant's point of view, is now becoming a separate other, and there's power disputes. So that's what he's talking about when he's talking about the anal stage. Now, we have fixations again here in stages 1 and 2. In stage 1, oral stage, the failure to obtain enough milk or enough sustenance to feel fulfilled, to feel satisfied, to quell the hunger on a regular basis might lead to from Freud's point of view, a permanent oral fixation. And you've probably heard the term oral fixation. And the idea is that this kind of person is always going to need something in their mouth. Always going to be chewing on something like an end of a pencil or nibbling on their hair. And they're always going to be gnawing on their nails, or something is going to be in their mouth more often than not, because from Freud's point of view, as early as 1 year old, they developed a lifelong habit. Now, I don't think there's any research to support that. In my world, that's just one of Freud's fables. But you can see how he arrived at it. Why do people do that at adult stages? Well, he's conjecturing that it goes all the way back to the oral stage, and you're stuck with it from then on. Putting stuff in your mouth, smoking on cigars, smoking on cigarettes, right? Putting stuff in your mouth, drinking out of a bottle instead of out of a cup. Because from him, you're trying to get this oral gratification. And he used to smoke cigars, and cigars are in the shape of a phallus, which, if you're not familiar with the term, is a penis. And so, you know, he having been accused of sucking on a lot of cigars, said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right? Don't read too much into it. Maybe he had a little bit of reaction formation. Who knows? Anal stage, though, you've got this power struggle, or maybe you don't have a power struggle. In the case of the anal retentive, and you've probably heard about that when you say, somebody says, oh, they're so anal. What most people mean is they're really uptight. And by uptight, they mean that they are really rigid about following the rules, having things be certain ways to be comfortable. And that uptightness from Freud at the adult level goes all the way back to an anal stage where a person had a very contentious toilet training experience, where they were struggling and they were punitively treated. So you can be supported in toilet training where people are like, oh, you made a mistake, you made a mess, that's okay, we'll clean it up, everybody has accidents, and we'll do it, but we'll do it right the next time, right? We'll give it another try, and that would be a supportive way of resolving the stage until the child is able to do that on their own. Or they could get, oh, you did it again, you made another mess, this is awful, when are you ever going to learn to do this? Negative, lots of really negative feedback. That there's something wrong with you fundamentally, and that you better get to it and snap in shape, and you get this rigidity that he says then lasts a lifetime, right? You become a rule follower trying to please others by making everything right because you were unable to get that support you needed in that critical phase of life. But there's another side to it. There's not only anal retentive, but anal expulsive. Kind of the sloppy person. So how does a sloppy person come about, right? They don't seem to, you may know people who have like pizza boxes stacked up to the roof, and they got cans and beer bottles everywhere in their houses, or whatever it is, or at their house you go into the kitchen and the sink's piled high, there may be stuff growing in there, and some people are like, this is nasty, and they're like, what do you mean? It's fine. It's no big deal. Who cares? Don't be so uptight, right? Well, how could they get so sloppy and be so okay with that? Because from Freud's point of view, they had a very permissive toileting experiences. Maybe they weren't not only weren't yelled at and made to feel bad about what was going on, but they weren't supported either. They were just kind of allowed to keep on going and doing the pooing and the peeing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you know, little kids don't think their shit stinks, right? They have to learn that. You ever see a baby go, woo, my diapers, man. 6-month-old don't care what it smells like. It doesn't seem to be affected at all. It just sits in its own waste products until somebody else comes and goes, woo, you stink, that's awful. And they learn that that smell is aversive to other people, and eventually they, woo, that's terrible. But some of us don't learn that till later. And from Freud's point of view, that's what you get in anal expulsive. Somebody that just wasn't pressed to learn how to control their eliminative functions early on, and later they're not all that bothered by things other people seem to be bothered.